that you? Welcome to Climate Chat.
Thank you.
I'm not sure where that extra buzzing just came. Let's see. I think it's from you because when I turned down your sound. But anyway, welcome to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller. And today our special guest is Wim Carton, who's a professor and author, and he's the author of The Long Heat along with Andreas Malm. And we're going to be talking about this book today. And it's really fascinating. I think everyone who listens to Climate Chat will really find what we're going to talk about interesting because the book covers so many issues that we talk about regularly here. It talks about adaption. It talks about carbon removal. It talks about solar geoengineering and really most fundamentally about what we have to do to fight climate change, which is really the central question of this program, and I would say the central question for the Earth right now. So, Wim, welcome to Climate Chat, and maybe you would start off by just telling us a little bit about your background and also the kind of research that you do.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am actually have a background in kind of history, international relations, and human geography, and I entered this field researching during my PhD kind of carbon offsetting and carbon offsetting markets, particularly those that are based around tree planting projects. Mm-hmm. And from there, kind of I rolled into the question of carbon dioxide removal. So I became very interested about this maybe, almost 10 years ago now, I suppose. And since then, I've been making this the main focus of my research. So I would say, so the book is about, as you said, a lot of things, but my main focus in my research is actually about carbon dioxide removal.
Okay, well, and speaking of your books, you actually have a previous book, which in some ways could be thought of as volume 1 to The Long Heat, and that's called Overshoot, right, with the same co-author. And since it does provide context for The Long Heat, maybe you can give us like a quick summary of Overshoot and what that's about, so then we can launch into The Long Heat.
Yeah, so I mean, Overshoot in a way is a kind of a narrating of history. It's an attempt to tell like how do we get here, and so our argument in Overshoot is that we are entering what we call the overshoot conjuncture, right? We're about to exceed 1.5 degrees, and that means that we're entering this phase where, and you see that very much in the scientific debate at the moment. There's a lot of talk about overshoot in general, right? So how do we handle this period where we're actually exceeding these temperature targets? What does that mean for climate politics? And so we talk about the kind of history of this in our book Overshoot, about both the way the overshoot concept was used and conceived in climate science, and how in some ways, an overshoot pathway in the sense of exceeding and then lowering temperatures has always been part of the climate conversation, at least for the past 2 decades or so in the models, right? But then also like the political economy of like what are the drivers pushing us beyond these temperature limits. So that's the main focus of Overshoot. And the Long Heat is then essentially trying to map what is happening now that we are at this moment where we are crossing these temperature targets. What are what we call the new frontiers of climate politics that we see emerging? How do we make sense of them, and what role do they play in kind of ambitious climate politics, essentially?
Okay, so there I have the Long Heat. By the way, there are links in the video description to the book and also to your Lund University page. So anybody wants to get more information, that's available. It's a let's go back here.
Big book.
It's a big book, but it's actually not quite as big because here I have the tab where the references and acknowledgments start. So it's a very well documented book. I might add. Any statement you make has a reference, and it's also even though it's a very serious topic, there's at times when it's actually kind of humorous and it's a very interesting read. I found, you're covering so many of the subjects that we cover here all the time, and you really go into in depth. So I really appreciate that, and I think people will enjoy the book. But let's just jump right in, because you cover I would say 3 main subjects. of the technological kind, and that's adaption, carbon removal, and solar geoengineering. So let's just start with adaption, because while I've heard the moral hazard argument applied to carbon removal and solar geoengineering, I haven't really heard it applied to adaption before, and it's not a subject actually that's even talked about as much. It's like something we have to do as we go forward. But can you tell us adaptation? You had like adaptationism was a phrase you used in your book. Can you tell us, what do you think of adaptation and its role in what's happening in climate?
Yeah, so I can just maybe say that, I mean, the adaptation is the smallest part of the three that we have in the book, right? So we don't spend a whole lot of time on it. And it's just because we kind of use adaptation to set up the way that technology is being used in contemporary capitalism, essentially within climate politics. So we use it as a way to say that, this is something that spans all of climate politics, and adaptation is a key part of, the kind of frontiers of climate politics as we move past 1.5 degrees. But so our argument essentially is that we absolutely do need adaptation. There's no question about the fact that adaptation will be necessary, but that there's this trend, and that both historically there's been many arguments and arguments that one sees kind of re-emerging in many ways, that adaptation becomes almost a substitute for emission reductions, that we can adapt to whatever failure of mitigation that we end up with. And that the trend in adaptation is very much what we call muscular adaptationism. It's this kind of, very technologically focused form of adaptation that is also, not taking into account, inequalities, and essentially that ends up, protecting the status quo in one way or another. So, and this is a central argument that then, runs through the rest of the book. This kind of the way that technologies are being used as a substitute for emission reductions, which we see as a risk in how adaptation is being framed, and something that we need to overcome to make adaptation into what we actually think it should be. And this is a form of progressive radical adaptation, where it's actually the people who are most vulnerable and most in need, and not just those with the most resources that can adapt to climate change. So that's the main argument there.
Okay, but so you're not against adaptation?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, it's something that we're going to have to do. But when it comes to carbon removal and solar geoengineering, that is something that you do seem to be opposed to, at least for now. Is that correct? I'm going to jump into those, but
so carbon removal less so than solar engineering, but to some extent, and this has to do also with the political economy of it, but we can definitely talk more about it. Yeah.
Okay, but I want to before we even dive into the specifics of those two things, there's two premises that I want to ask you about. So one is, you make the case, it's sort of what we call the moral hazard argument, that if we have carbon removal, we have solar geoengineering, it's going to give it more social license to the fossil fuel industries to keep doing what they're doing, and we're just going to make the problem worse rather than better. I mean, you have other arguments against it too, by the way. But that is one of the key ones. So I just want to ask you, because it's certainly not clear to me that if carbon removal and solar geoengineering just disappeared from the concept of the world, I mean, they were not available. We never thought of them. I don't know, whatever you want to say. Do you think that we would now be aggressively reducing carbon emissions?
No, probably not. I mean, I definitely don't think that. So to me, the moral hazard, or we call it mitigation deterrence, I mean, there's different terms in the literature, argument isn't saying that, this is the prime driver of delay or obstruction in climate politics, right? There's very many, and probably very many more important reasons why we're not actually, mitigating climate change to the extent that we should. But there's a strong tendency, I think, both on the corporate side of things and on the national country level side of things, to kind of look for all kinds of excuses and arguments to not do the things that need to be done. Mm-hmm. And that is where mitigation deterrence comes in, because I think carbon removal, and this is a very big part of our argument, has always been used by actually very influential actors to do exactly that. So it's always been used as an excuse not to reduce emissions in the near term. It's always been used actually to downplay even the possibility of urgent emission reductions. And I think it's hard to, I mean, if you look at the history of both the science and like the politics around this, it's really hard to deny this. But that to me, at least, and to us, is not the same as saying that if we didn't have these technologies, all would be fine and we'd be on this trajectory to, radical mitigation. That is definitely, I think, incumbent interests, powerful actors would probably find other excuses, right? I mean, because the underlying drivers of this is it's more fundamental than this, but it doesn't help to produce, I think, these kind of, to provide these kind of alternative solutions that can be used in that way.
Well, okay. I mean, first of all, I think, the excuse du jour. I mean, it's like they'll use whatever excuse. And by the way, they didn't really exist. You said, maybe the last 10, 20 years. When Jim Hansen testified to Congress in 1988, laid out what we had to do, all we did was increase emissions rapidly, and we didn't have those as an excuse back then.
Yeah.
So to me, I don't know. I just can't imagine that all of a sudden we'd be doing emissions reduction rapidly if all of a sudden those things disappeared. But then there's the question that they do provide benefits. The carbon removal lowers CO2 content of the atmosphere. Solar geoengineering cools the earth and perhaps prevents tipping points and things. And so isn't it really just like saying we're not going to take climate action seriously? We're not going to tell the fossil fuel companies what to do. We're going to just ask them to pretty please lower their emissions. And therefore, if they have these excuses, they won't pretty please do it. So rather than telling them, oh, by the way, you're phasing out fossil fuels starting now, here's the ramp down, that would be serious climate action. So aren't you kind of saying we're not going to have serious climate action?
So, I mean, this is a big topic and one could talk very long about it. But I think, so first of all, I think we're not arguing, particularly on carbon removal, we're not arguing against the utility of carbon removal. As you say, carbon removal has many potential benefits. Our argument isn't to deny those benefits. It definitely has the potential to reduce temperatures. Our argument is twofold in a way. But first, there's the geophysical argument, right? Meaning the whole kind of argument against reversibility, and that we cannot take reversibility for granted. And this is because of feedbacks and tipping points and all these kind of things. So, it's not a guaranteed strategy. And this is an argument maybe mainly against this kind of programmatic form of overshoot, where it's always been somehow baked into that this would be the trajectory that we would follow. Maybe more importantly, our argument is against the way that carbon removal is currently being used within current political economic systems. And essentially we're arguing three things. We're arguing one thing that takes three forms, and it is that carbon removal, in the absence of state commitments to do this for the sake of carbon removal itself, is taking the form of for-profit carbon removal. And for-profit carbon removal takes three forms. Either you use it as an offset, and this is mainly how startups are trying to fund what they are doing. Right. It's the most common way of funding. Or you have enhanced oil recovery, which is also what some direct air capture companies and so on are trying to do with carbon removal. Or you try and produce commodities, which is the most, I guess, serious form of that is synthetic fuels, for example.
Fuels.
Synthetic fuels, yeah. And all of those are, ways in which companies are trying to, make money out of drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. All of them are also, in one way or another, opposed to the idea of permanent removal, in the sense that when you have carbon removal as an offset, you basically, continue. You can't reverse climate change. You can't. Because obviously you're allowing the continuation of business as usual. You're allowing the continuation of some form of emissions. At most, you could get to net zero, but it's very clear from the scientific literature that the amount of carbon removal that we could sustainably do is rather limited, and so there's not enough carbon removal, or there shouldn't be enough carbon removal to just compensate for all current fossil fuel emissions, or even a massive amount of fossil fuel emissions. And that there's a a conflict there between, if you use that carbon removal capacity for compensating for continuous fossil fuel emissions in some form, in the form of an offset, that is carbon removal infrastructure that you will not have available to then, lower temperatures in an absolute sense, meaning after we have shot past 1.5 degrees and you want to compensate for that overshoot. So that is the dilemma, I think, that we see.
Well, I don't understand that last part. Wait, I'm sorry. I've heard the argument that if we do carbon removal, then we're not doing as much renewable energy because we're using some of that renewable energy for carbon removal. And that's much more efficient of, dollars per CO2 avoided, let's say. Is that what you're saying? Or are you saying something else? I might have missed it.
No, I'm saying that there's, carbon removal comes with land, resource, energy, water use in some form, right? Which means that there's no limitless amount of it. So that if you kind of allocate that carbon removal capacity to help you achieve net zero, and net zero with a high level of residual emissions, then that is carbon removal that you cannot also use to reduce temperatures. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
And that the current, political economy, in the absence, and obviously the solution here is to have states come in, right, and do this for the sake of reversing climate change and compensating for overshoot. But we're just not seeing that. But in the absence of that, you'll have this kind of for-profit removal that is, by definition, we argue, incapable of kind of lowering temperatures in the sense of compensating for that overshoot. So that is our main critique against carbon removal.
Okay. And by the way, first of all, as someone who advocates for carbon removal, I totally agree that those are the business models. But the reason those are the business models is because we're not taking climate action seriously, and we don't have a price on carbon or policies that require phase down, and where that could be used maybe as part of the phase down. But that would drive the quote right kind. But we're not doing that. We're just choosing to fail, as Kevin Anderson puts it. So there's one other premise. Okay, that's one of them, and we might even get back to that one a little bit later. So one is, if you got rid of these things, would that somehow get us to do more emissions reduction? And as you said, it's probably some other excuses lined up. But there's really a more fundamental assumption here, and that is that you want to focus, if I have it correct, on emissions reduction. That's the main thing, and then also adapting and I think collective repair, like to repair ecosystems being harmed by climate. And there's an assumption there that with emissions reduction alone, we can do that. And that's not my understanding of what's happening here. We're heading to 2 degrees for sure. I mean, no matter how successful, and we're really both on the same exact page in terms of wanting the world to take emissions reduction as seriously as possible, just get rid of fossil fuels as quick as possible. But that's not happening. And even if it did, as you point out in your book, it's not something that has much of an impact for a long time. I mean, we start doing emissions reduction even aggressively, which we're not, but if we did, we're still going to 2 and to 3, as far as I can tell. And that's not necessarily survivable for civilization. So the idea of emissions reduction alone, is it something that we could actually live with?
Yeah, so I mean, we're not arguing for emission reductions alone. We're arguing for a very strong, I think we call it a crystal clear sense of priority in the conclusion, a very strong prioritization of emission reductions in the present. And this is because both with carbon removal, for the exact reasons that I just said, right? Carbon removal can only be successful in helping to lower the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere if we don't also use it to compensate for continued fossil fuel emissions. So that means that carbon removal is entirely dependent on rapid emission reductions at the same time. And that, I mean, for us, it's just that as long as emissions haven't even peaked yet, and of course, we've been talking about emissions peaking next year for like the past 10 years or so, they still haven't peaked. They're probably, obviously they will peak at some point and probably even soon. But the point being, as long as we haven't done that, to me, it is a distraction to talk about the next phase already, because I think there's still so much work to do on emission reduction. This is not to say that this alone is sufficient, because obviously once we have succeeded with emission reductions, you'll be stuck at that temperature level, and then you want to reduce it as much as possible, and that will require carbon removal in some form. It's just that to me and to us, that is not something that comes now. It is something that is staged, and it's staged at a point. And this is both to avoid the risk that it's used as a substitute, but also because the most important task in making carbon removal useful is actually emission reduction. So this is why that to us is the priority, essentially.
But don't.
And I think.
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying. So I mean, I think in the conclusion we're very clear that carbon removal is something that we should acknowledge the very real appeal and use of, but that we should be very careful about how it's used politically, and that means, as we call it, a crystal clear sense of priority.
But don't we need? But right now, carbon removal, as you talk about in the book, is very tiny. I mean, it literally has to scale up by 1,000,000-fold to have tens of gigatons a year to be useful in reducing CO2 in the atmosphere. It has to be in that, and which you talk about actually. So we're in agreement on that. But we're not going to just go to there immediately. It's going to have to, just like solar panels took 30, well, actually longer than that, but the last 30 years is really what went from a very expensive, interesting thing to something that's a cheap, useful thing. And isn't that going to be the same for carbon removal?
It is, absolutely, but as we just talked about, I think if you just try to scale carbon removal in the present, what you will get is carbon offsets, enhanced oil recovery, or commodities.
Till we get serious,
and that is not the carbon removal that we want. So I think, and this is where both with solar geoengineering and carbon removal and emission reductions, the conditions for increasing emission reductions and increasing the speed at which they happen are the same, to me at least, are the same that are needed to make carbon removal useful and to make sure that they are not used as a substitute. So that is why it makes sense to prioritize on that kind of political work first. This is not to say that we shouldn't do any research on any of these things, right? But I think once we have an industry that is scaled and it is locked into a certain kind of political and economic logic, it's very hard to change that. So before we do that, I think we should put the right conditions in place. And they're not in place at the moment. And this is why, and those conditions are the same across all climate politics. And that is essentially, I think, getting, this kind of profit motive out of it and having a more kind of democratic, state-led form of climate politics. I know these are not easy things, right? This is not something that comes about very easily, and one could talk very, very, very long time about how exactly to do that and why it has failed. But it doesn't take away, I think, the fact that that is what is needed.
Well, I definitely want to get back to that, because that, of course, that is the key question of all of this: is can we even do that? How do we do that? But before we do that, I do want to. So we covered CDR a little bit. Your book goes into a lot more detail, has a lot more interesting, detailed information on it and where we are now, where it could go. But let's move on to solar geoengineering, because that one actually seems maybe to be, I don't know, the most controversial in some sense. And sure. Maybe we could just start out. You can just summarize for us. Everyone who's listening knows what solar geoengineering here. We have a whole playlist. We've had David Keith on and Doug McMartin. We've had lots of researchers taking a look at the impacts of solar geoengineering and stuff like that, how to do it, whatever. So people know what it is. But maybe you could give us your objections to implementing solar geoengineering. Well, by the way, implementing, don't think anyone's saying, let's just go implement it right now. They're saying, research the hell out of it so we understand what we're doing. And once we understand it and we think the benefits outweigh, the problems, then go ahead. Let's define it that way.
Yeah, even though I think there are some people advocating for pretty near-term the deployment.
Well, we had to make Sunset guys on here as well. So.
Well, you did. Okay. So yeah, so this is definitely the more controversial part of it, right? And so our main argument against, and so this is what distinguishes carbon removal and geoengineering in the book, is that we very clearly kind kind of lay out a potential kind of carbon removal form that one could position oneself behind in the future, a kind of form of progressive removal, we see the potential for that. We do not see that with solar geoengineering. And the reason for this is as follows. We think there's something of a contradiction at work in the kind of discussions on solar geoengineering. Most people that work on solar geoengineering, I think, would agree that solar geoengineering, for it to be justifiable, has to kind of live up to a few conditions. One, it needs to be done responsibly, in line with careful consideration of the many side effects that there could be, right? It has to be done in a gradual, measured, and limited way, in line with what the science says. And above all, perhaps it has to go hand in hand with rapid emission reduction, because if you don't, then you run into this risk of determination shock and so on. And proponents of solar geoengineering, we argue, base their case for the potential for a form of progressive form of geoengineering on current failures of climate policy, right? They say that because mitigation has failed, because it continues to fail, we essentially need to start thinking about solar geoengineering. So this means that we somehow are asked to conclude that policymakers and international institutions have been inadequate to the task of emission reductions, and that this is why geoengineering needs to be considered. But this is also where the contradiction lies, because at the same time as one does that and recognizes that our country institutions have been inadequate at the task, we put our faith in those very same institutions to deliver on that kind of responsible geoengineering that we say will be needed to avoid side effects and determination shock. And we do not see that as tenable. When it comes to solar engineering, it seems to us that the most likely case is that it will be governed in line with current political economic institutions, where self-interest and geopolitics and all of these things predominate the form that it takes, and that the very real scenario that anyone that advocates solar engineering needs to consider is because of course this is a technology, unlike carbon removal, that can be concentrated in very few hands, right? It's relatively
expensive, relatively easy to do. I mean, compared to
relatively expensive. One state could potentially do
absolutely.
And so we need to consider what that would look like within our current political system. And so we need to consider what it would mean if somebody like Donald Trump or Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin essentially would de facto gain control of global temperatures, and tries to tweak it in such a way that it's beneficial for the US, but maybe not potentially for other latitudes or for other countries. There's a lot of kind of potential for conflict and tensions here, and we somehow fail to see how one can overcome that without also essentially fundamentally rethinking the way our political system works. So within the kind of political landscape that we see at the present, we think there's more risk than benefits with solar geoengineering.
Well, let's talk about that, because I mean the whole reason you do solar geoengineering is because all hell's going to break loose. I mean, we have an AMOC that might collapse in 2050, which would screw everything, especially where you live, by the way, in Sweden. But that's kind of the least of the problem, is the fact that you'll be 20 C under, lower temperatures where you live, which is incredible to even say those words. But that's the least of it. Massive sea level rise, the less rainfall across the entire northern hemisphere. We had someone on, Peter Irvine, who did research showing that correct solar geoengineering could prevent AMOC collapse by obviously freezing the right parts of the poles. And the other thing that solar geoengineering does is it greatly lowers emissions, because emissions are caused by two things: by humans emitting burning fossil fuels, but it's also by the warming caused by that releases more emissions. That's how you get climate sensitivity, right? And so we had someone on, I don't recall the name right now, but also showing that that would greatly cut overshoot if we use solar geoengineering, because you wouldn't have the emissions in response to the warming. And so given all of that, and also the fact that 3 degrees may not be survivable from a civilization point of view. So with all the problems you mentioned of geoengineering, how do you view the problems of not doing geoengineering? What world is that we're surviving in while reducing emissions?
Yeah. So, but this is where I think it's very crucial to make a decision. So I don't deny the very real problems that we are facing if we fail to mitigate, right? I mean, you're right that, AMA collapse and 3 degrees would be completely disastrous. I think the argument we make is not to deny that. It is to say that if we do geoengineering in a way that is not done responsibly, meaning not measured, and that does not at the same time cut emissions, which is the most likely scenario in our case, in our assessment, under current political economic conditions, it is no guarantee at all that it's going to be. I mean, you could just get a 3-degree world plus a lot of geopolitical conflict around geoengineering, essentially, or you could get, sure, temperatures could go down, but then autocrats could change their mind or whatever, right? I mean, so there's just a lot of potential for that to go wrong. But the fundamental point perhaps is that, and this is what we hint at also in the conclusion, is just that to us there's a fundamental difference between what we see necessary in the present and what one might see necessary in the future. Meaning that I actually disagree with the argument that 3 degrees is baked in at the moment, or even 2 degrees. And that
you don't believe that 3 degrees is baked in?
That 3 degrees is somehow inevitable at this point. I mean, sure, on current trajectories, but there's so much more to fight for to prevent that from happening. And I think supporting geoengineering at this moment, when there is so much more to fight for, is counterproductive and in essence dangerous because of everything we just said. That doesn't mean that there might not be a situation in the future where that is not the case anymore. I mean, and we open up for that. But in the present, I think we don't see that potential, because exactly the potential for avoiding. This is not to say that 1.5 degrees is not bad, of course, but the potential for avoiding the real kind of catastrophic forms of warming that we talk about at 2 and 3 degrees to be avoided is still there. And I know this is an argument essentially about like the potential for political change. And this is where, in a way, we're on the disadvantage, right? I mean, everybody sees where current climate politics is heading. But it is also the case that, climate politics happens not just, in the White House and in the European Commission, and it's not just global politics. I mean, these kind of, as a social scientist, I think this is really important. This kind of, the scientific work in the form of imaginaries that we produce of the form of climate politics that are possible is crucial in this as well. So I think, actually, as climate researchers, we have a responsibility in trying to, bring these alternatives forward and keep insisting on their possibility. And I think and we could talk actually quite a lot about like the historical work of scenario analysis and so on that has in many ways failed to do that and that has underplayed the potentials for mitigation by for example overestimating the cost of renewables or overestimating the role that carbon capture would play, which are all things, dynamics that one sees in the IPCC, in the integrated assessment model scenarios. So in the present moment, I think our responsibility is to focus on something else. But we realize, of course, that, yes, geoengineering, it has the potential to cut temperatures. It has the potential to do a lot of other things as well. And we see very big risks with that. And that is where our
some people say that, first of all, as you point out in your book, the people that suffer the most from climate change are the global south, the poor, the people who don't have the resources, the ones not really causing climate change or very, very little. and they're suffering the most now, and certainly will in the future. So can't you see like this avoidance of geoengineering to give the developed countries more reason to lower their emissions? Isn't that like sort of causing the global south to suffer more, to give the rich countries reasons to cut emissions? Doesn't it sound a little bit like that?
Well, if nothing happens, then of course that's where you end up. But I mean, the whole point is to try to change that. So I mean,
No, but even if you do it, I mean, even okay, let's say you get on the path to emissions reduction, as you point out in the book, that it's a very slow process to have any impact whatsoever. You won't even notice for decades that you even started to lower your emissions, even though you really need to do it. But as you also point out, geoengineering, like that, you find out it's cooler. So they're suffering now. They're going to suffer more over the next 30 years, let's say. Even if we are lowering our emissions, it's going to get. By the way, I want to get back to 2 degrees. Do you think? We interviewed Jim Hansen not that long ago. He says ECS, equilibrium climate sensitivity, is 4.5 degrees, not what the IPCC says is 3. Leon Simons, one of our co-hosts here, shows that the actual measured data from satellites shows it's way higher than what the IPCC says. Forcings are higher. We're at RCP 8.5, not emission scenario levels, but at forcing levels. And so Hansen said there's absolutely no way we're not going over 2, no matter what you say. And what's your feeling on it? Because this is kind of critical to this whole argument, right?
Well, I guess there's 2 things here. First, one is the kind of actually, as you say, climate sensitivity and the way the climate system will react to continued emissions, and crucially, I suppose, the feedbacks and tipping points that one might set in motion at some point.
Like AMOC and whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So, but on a fundamental level, I mean, the whole scientific concept of net zero is built around the idea, of course, that if you get rid of net emissions, then temperatures cease to rise.
But only if you're lucky.
Yes, exactly. But that's what our whole system is of course structured around. So I think fundamentally emission reductions and temperatures are a consequence of political decisions, right? It's about like how fast countries are willing to act, and so I mean, there's just, I think, so much that we need to do to keep pressing those countries and the people who are able to do this to actually speed up, and this is where our responsibility lies. So this is why I don't. Yes, on current trajectories, right, 2 degrees is very likely. I mean, I would also, if you would ask me to place bets, then this is probably where I would place my bet as well, because this is where politics is heading. But probability and possibility are not the same thing, and I think we have a responsibility to keep pressing for a different kind of possibility. And I would insist that it is still possible to, 1.5 degrees is, obviously that ship has sailed at this point, but 2 degrees.
We're there now, yeah.
It has not politically.
But I would argue, again, we cover this on the show a lot, and Leon Simons covers this a lot, is that the measured data, so forget, everything else, the Earth energy imbalance is so high that it's not possible to avoid 2 degrees at this point. Forget what the IPCC says, and they're 3 degrees.
Yeah.
And their carbon, by the way, which are from 2014, they're not like today's situation. It's really old data. But the actual measured data shows, and Hansen just gave another talk on this recently, it's huge, and it's like not. I'll put it this way: it may not be scientifically possible to stay under 2 degrees without solar geoengineering, because that's the one thing that can turn down the temperature. The other ones, as you point out, don't turn it down. They just, if you're lucky, stop it from keeping going up. But let's move on, because the most important thing you're raising, and I 100% agree with you, is let's change it. And we try to cover that on this show. But we not only have climate scientists and solution providers, but we have psychiatrists and communication professionals and other people that try to talk to us about why we aren't doing what we need to be doing. So let's just jump right into it. What do you think we need to do, or how are we going to get there? Maybe is the best way to say it.
I mean, I think there is no other way than through social mobilization, organization, and social movements putting pressure on these kind of institutionalized forms of decision making. That is democratically, that is the way it has to happen. And um, you know, obviously the climate movement at this moment in time isn't where it was 5 or 6 years ago, just after the 2018 report, right? So we're in a very different situation there, but that still is, I think, the pathway that one needs to pursue. And this is because, of course, policymakers and fossil fuel interests are, so entangled in many ways at different levels that it requires popular resistance to kind of break that. And I think we have seen, historically, the potential for things to move once that actually takes scale. But and I don't have any easy answer here, and I think nobody does. But that is ultimately, I think, what needs to happen, and that is the big question of like, how do you build that movement in a very quick way, that achieves sufficient mass to be able to shift politics. Global politics. This is the change that needs to happen now is not technological; it's political, and that goes for carbon removal, it goes for adaptation, and it goes for geoengineering. And this is why it is necessary to prioritize political change, because it's the same work you need to do irrespective of what you're talking about. If you're talking about emission reductions or carbon removal, you need to get you need to get a different sense of priority in place politically, and that means getting rid of this kind of profit motive that drives things. And people have talked about, like, the Green New Deal and New Deal and kind of wartime mobilization as kind of analogs for this, right? And one can bicker with the extent to which these analogs are reasonable, but I think the key point there is that, and this is maybe also the point that one can take from China in some ways, actually, that we shouldn't underestimate the speed of change that is possible once political institutions actually put their political power behind that. Mm-hmm. I think things can move quite quickly, and it has been possible in the past to some extent in limited ways. There's no reason why it can't be possible in the present and in the future.
Except that climate is a different kind of problem than others that are immediate, right? We're not evolved to react to long-term problems. We grew up on the savannah a couple 100,000 years ago, and the only thing you worried about was two things: what am I going to eat today, and who's going to try to eat me? Or what's going to try to eat me? And a problem 2 weeks out probably didn't get your attention. So our brains, and we've had George Marshall, you probably know him, his book about why we can't think about climate change. I was just at a wedding yesterday. Progressive people and everything. Of course, everywhere I go, I bring up climate, and people are not engaged. They don't know about it. They know about it, but they have no idea how bad it is or where it's going. And I would even say among some climate scientists, think, we'll muddle through, and I don't get it. So where is the kernel? I mean, people watching the show, of course, and there's Greta Thunberg and there's others, but it's a very small amount of people that are actively engaged on climate versus, by the way, trying to protect democracy in the United States versus all the stuff happening in Europe and migrants. Where is the kernel of this movement going to come from?
That's a very good question, and again, I'm not sure I have the answer. I think this becomes even worse in our current kind of media climate as well, where the ways in which people source information are so infused with, like, ideology, and like people are in their kind of own information bubble. So it's social media is making this situation so much worse than it already was in some ways. But yes, this is the challenge. I would say I don't think it's a matter of kind of brain capacity or like human evolution. As much as I recognize that climate it's an unusual, perhaps, and a peculiar problem, and we should be careful, therefore, of the analogs we draw. But it's essentially about like building the institutions that are able to infuse that sense of urgency. So, and this is the chicken and the egg problem, of course, because you need the people to be in some way at least aware of it, to get the institutions in place. But you also, I think, need the institutions in place to make sure that education and information and so on is fact-based, and that there's a prioritization of climate change throughout.
But we have, as you point out, the fossil fuel capital is the thing you focus on in the book, and that capital controls the government, at least in the United States, and certainly the media, and I would say many other places around the world besides the United States. That's true. And they have money and influence and propaganda and
absolutely. And this is why, I mean, this question is so much bigger than climate, right? I mean, this is about democracy, and it's about our political system in general. And this is why exactly it spans like all of these technologies. It's not just limited to emission reduction. You need to get this in place irrespective, or you'll end up in a very undesirable place where we don't want to be. So it's a very, very difficult question, and obviously one we have failed to answer and respond to so far. But we will have to do it in one way or another, or we're in a very bad position.
Right. Well, I think we're in a bad position now because, again, what I think not everyone realizes when you talk about ECS, or equilibrium climate sensitivity, it's the amount of warming you get for a doubling of CO2 is sort of the standard measure. But as Hansen pointed out, you get the first third of the warming in the first 10 years, the next third in the next 100, and the next third in the next 1,000 years. And so we're not, I mean, just from what we've already done, and we're really at a doubling when you throw in all the other non-CO2 greenhouse gases. We're not done warming. And again, all the measurements say we're going way faster than we thought. So given all of that, it really, I think it comes down to like survival, like waiting. I mean, the argument, again, back to solar geoengineering, you don't have a way we're going to like overnight do this. And by the way, I think even if it was overnight, the fact that emissions reduction takes so long, well, let's just pick AMOC collapse. Let's just say you were convinced, you listened to Climate Chat, all the other programs we've done on this, and you're convinced now that there's a very serious risk of passing the AMOC tipping point, let's say 2050. And by the way, that doesn't mean it shuts down in 2050, but that's game over. It's going to take another 30 to 100 years, but it's going, and nothing you're going to do to stop it at that point. But let's just say you also believed our interview with Peter Irvine, and you said that we can stop, well, actually somebody else said, but you can stop AMOC collapse with solar geoengineering. Would you then say, oh, okay, there's no even theoretical way we're going to stop AMOC collapse with emissions reduction, no matter what I think, no matter how much I hope it's going to happen, would you then give it some serious thought, because that's going to screw everybody forever?
So to me, the problem is like, because we will not know, I guess, that the AMOC is collapsing until it's actually happening. And at that point, the question is, I suppose, is solar engineering even still a possibility? It depends, like, at what point do we become aware that the tipping point has been passed, I suppose. Well,
it is slowing down, right? I think there's general agreement that 15 to 20% slowdown. And then, it feeds on itself. So once you hit a certain point, then it's slowing down, makes it slow down. And then you get to the spiral where you get the collapse. But we don't know that answer yet. But all the recent research last 2 years is pointing more and more and more. Talk to like Stefan Ramsdorf or someone, that this is much higher risk than we ever thought.
Yeah, he talks about a risk of up to 50% in a recent podcast I heard him speak on.
Which
so,
is,
I mean,
by the way, who would accept that if you're going to fly in an airplane?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a very serious situation, but I think, I mean, our argument is just that we don't see a situation in which if geoengineering is deployed at the moment to stop that it would by necessity take on a form that is, it might, reduce temperatures, but it might also, create all of these other problems. And it might.
Are you talking about things like shifting monsoons and things like that, or what other problems do you mean?
Yeah, I mean,
Or
shifting
keeping the emissions
precipitation
going.
patterns and droughts and potentially monsoons, but also just geopolitical conflict. I'm thinking actually mainly of that, where if you're in a situation where you have a very serious climate crisis, and then you kind of throw in there, and this is why we have the analogy of the nuclear bomb in the book, right? We say that geoengineering is essentially the nuclear bomb of climate politics. It's very effective as a weapon. I'm not saying geoengineering is a weapon, but it's very effective. But it's also like it's completely changing the kind of political situation. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the very real conflicts that could give rise to, especially if we're not sure about the side effects, right? Sure, it might, help prevent. I mean, imagine that it does prevent the AMOC from collapsing, but then at the same time, it shuts down the Asian monsoon. And essentially, you're saying like, well, we're prioritizing the US and Western Europe, and India can go and screw itself in some way. So, I mean, there's going to be trade-offs that will take on very difficult forms, I imagine, and that are very hard to envisage beforehand.
But here's the part I don't get. Okay, so, and this is the issue when everyone brings up the problems of geoengineering. I don't think it's possible to talk about the problems of geoengineering without talking about the problems of not doing geoengineering. So there's an implication in what you just said that if we don't do it, we can avoid the Indian monsoons from collapsing. But I think that's not true at all. I think that if we don't do geoengineering, there is no question we're going to, again, get over 2 degrees. And there's going to be implications far and wide that are really bad. I mean, just some we have no idea about, but a lot we do. And so the question is not, does geoengineering have any side effects? Let's say, yeah, sure. We have some limitation on them because it does happen naturally with volcanoes. So we know what happens. They're not all good, but we're still around. But when it comes to 2 or 3 degrees, it's not very clear at all we're going to be around. And so I just don't understand when you say, I'm worried about the monsoon. Aren't you worried about the monsoon if the AMOC collapsed? By the way, all those monsoons in the Amazon are out the door. Yeah. Everything is screwed up. Every weather system in the world is going to be in the wrong place. I mean, every agriculture region is going to be in the wrong place.
But my point, I guess, is that we need to weigh whatever geoengineering is repressing or shutting down versus what we might get in return, and that is a very difficult assessment to make. But it is also very much, and this is exactly what we end up in, opening up towards a little bit, right? I think we should assess that. I mean, if it is the case that we see that now the science is sufficiently settled to say that the AMOX is on the point of collapsing, then I think we should assess our options and put everything on the table and see what that looks like. But we're not there, and this is the crucial point, I think. And until we're not there, we need to avoid that from happening. And I think there are still pathways that prevent the AMOC from collapsing, with emission reductions. It will be extremely radical and rapid and so on, but there's uncertainty in the system. And again, that is something that needs to happen regardless. So I mean, even if you end up choosing geoengineering to prevent a situation, you will want to have a politics in place that shuts down emissions very fast, or you'll be in an even worse situation. And so there's nothing to lose by prioritizing emission reduction.
There is possible you could lose greatly because you end up getting all the impacts of the warming that's built in. Even with, remember, we emitted 2.6 trillion tons, and we're doing about 50 or so per year. So eliminating it down to zero only reduces the increase by less than 2% a year, right? So it's already there.
Yeah.
It's already, the last time this much CO2 was in the atmosphere, sea levels were 75 feet higher. So there's a lot
Yeah.
that's built in that we haven't seen yet, that even if we cut our emissions to, well, we're not going to cut it to zero, but let's say cut to zero over 50 years or something. I guess we agree really on most of this, except that I'm far less optimistic than you are about
Yeah, I'm
what
not
the
sure I'm
current
optimistic. I'm
warming
just
and
pessimistic
trajectory we
about
are.
what else could happen. But I should also just say that we're not actually arguing against researching geoengineering. I mean, we're really talking about the kind of promotion of near-term deployment. This is what our main concern is. And we're pessimistic about the prospect of any kind of geoengineering in the future. But we do, and we actually don't discuss this in the book, but we've discussed this a bit privately. And I mean, and there's people who take a more radical position on this as well. And there's definitely, there's the slippery slope argument, and there's the risk that
Right.
research locks in other things. But I think there is a case for researching these things, but then one has to really be very strict about the conditions under which this happens. And I mean, the case of Stardust Solutions at the moment shows that the conditions are not in place, right, for that to happen. You don't want this to be developed, researched. I don't even know if you could call it research, but developed by a for-profit company that is, attempting to essentially
with shady connections,
intellectual
right?
property rights. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. So that's well, I mean, I also totally agree that these technologies can be used as excuses, are used as excuses, but again, I think if they didn't exist, it wouldn't change anything. So I mean, there's that other aspect of, are we and how can we come to a point where we take climate action seriously, and instead of choosing to fail, which is what we're doing now, as Kevin Anderson puts it, but choose to succeed. And in my mind, once we do choose to succeed, the solutions include rapid emissions reduction, carbon removal to get us back to 350 or below, and then also geoengineering to give us time to do those other two, because 2-3 degrees, it's going to be such an impact on society that it's going to be hard to do anything, I think, at that point.
But so to me, this is where all of these debates center around. It's around how, in an ideal situation, how fast people think emissions could be reduced, and whether there's a political possibility for the world to look different from it is today. And I think when you're arguing that, you're essentially arguing that, what we have today is somehow locked in, and we will not be able to get rid of it. And that is why 2 or 3 degrees is inevitable. And that is what I think we would dispute, is that we need to work for a situation that is fundamentally different from that. And that therein lies the possibility still of reducing emissions more rapidly.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow you. You're saying that the status quo is we're not reducing emissions. I'm assuming that's going to continue, versus imagining a world where they could drop rapidly. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that all of these discussions are about like where we place the limits of possibility in terms of mitigation in an ideal kind of situation. And I think some people are more skeptical of the fact that we could change our political systems, and therefore assume, and this is where I take your position to be, and therefore are pessimistic about the possibility to stay within 2 and 3 degrees. And some people see that as not unavoidable, and that we can change our political systems to prioritize climate in a very different way.
Well, by the way, I'm hoping, and I 100% agree, that we need to do that, and we're always trying to figure out how to do that, and let's even assume it happened. I guess the difference between you and I is that I think that even if we did that, next year we got on the path of rapid, we're going to go down. I think that the actual data on climate is that it's not the way it is now. When you emit all this stuff, there's way more warming coming than you think, because it's a over time process. It's not your warming today. People confuse that. That's 1.5. So if we stopped today, we'd be at 1.5. There is that belief. But if ECS is really 50% more than the IPCC says, and Hansen lays out 3 totally independent ways that we know that, and if the Earth energy imbalance is what it actually is measured to be today, we're not stopping at 1. We're not stopping at 2. Even if we do what you're saying, and because that's I think where the difference really comes, right? If you're right and we could stop. By the way, I'm not sure if stopping at 2. I mean, 2 is catastrophic, and that's our goal, right? So I don't think it's a good goal. But even if it was, let's say, we're going beyond 2. I think even if we did everything you want to do, which by the way is exactly what I want to do too. But you and I both don't know how to do it. But putting that aside, I again, as I said, I think I'm less optimistic than you are about what happens in aggressive emissions reduction.
Yeah, but can I ask you something else? So why is this not like, I mean, I recognize this argument. I've read Hansen's papers on this as well, and I know there's this debate. So why is this still not the scientific consensus in the IPCC, you think? Because there, of course, the idea is very strongly that if you stay to net, if you cut emissions and you get them to net zero, then, you know, temperature rise will stop. That's essentially that is the concept.
That is, you're exactly right. That is the question. He was on the program talking about that. And of course, he was disinvited from going to COP last year because he had this paper out that said you're wrong, you know, and and climate scientists, mainstream, the ones that the press talk to, he's saying this, not me. He said it very directly, that there are some mainstream climate scientists who we've interviewed on the show who said, oh, Hansen's paper, it's out of the mainstream, it's not right. They didn't provide any criticism to the science. They didn't say, oh, this is wrong, this is wrong. They hadn't even read the paper because this was the day after the paper came out, right? And so the press heard them and said, oh, we better not cover this because and so Hansen's going around saying, hey, I'm not being covered here. And you know, it get back to a lot of the things you talk about. There's this desire to have a good outcome, to cut emissions and then level temperatures, and everyone wants to believe that. And if someone comes along and says you're wrong, they don't want to listen to that. Why are climate scientists, as you put it, like why are they building in these overshoot models when they know that doesn't work? I mean, you know, because they were told to do it, but so I don't know. Look at the data. We cover the science, and you can look at the actual measured data, not even the theories. Now, just Earth energy imbalance, what's happening, absorbed solar radiation. So the Earth is dimmed 0.5% in the last 25 years, as measured by satellites. You do the calculations, and you throw in a certain amount for ice melting, which is actually a small part of it. Take into account the ship aerosol reduction, which is a part of it, but then you're left with the rest, and that's 4.5 C of Earth climate sensitivity. And like, you know, you can do the math yourself, actually. It's not that hard. So anyway, the answer to your question is people don't want to hear this stuff. And he's been right all along, by the way, since 1981, I think, when he published his first science paper right on this. And it doesn't fit the narrative, all the things you lay out in your book. And that's why no one's listening. We do try to cover it here without sugarcoating stuff, and that's why I think we and obviously several others covered.
Yeah, no, but I buy that, and I mean the IPCC has been conservative in many ways, right? And I think that is a critique that many people have made. But to me, the challenge then is still like, I mean, even if we anticipate a future in which 2 and 3 degrees are biophysically baked in, like how do we govern solar engineering? Like how would that actually work?
We had Suchi Talati on, who has an organization try to the correct governance. I forget what it's called, of geoengineering. Absolutely. By the way, but if a comet was coming to the Earth, you'd also have a big problem of governance of what to do about it. But you still better figure out what to do about it, because the Earth doesn't care about our governance, doesn't care about these other things. But by the way, to get back to your question about Hansen. So you think that geoengineering and carbon removal are problems for the fossil capital industry, right? Imagine what Hansen's message is, that it's really 4.5 instead of 3, and that you're not going to stop when you cut your emissions to 0. That message is verboten, right? It doesn't work. And so I think that's as that's as much of a problem as what you're bringing up. So I think that's why.
Yeah,
it amazes me
I guess
that it's not being covered much. By the way, it's
yeah.
Anyway,
no, that's absolutely.
By the way, this has been a great discussion. We covered so much, and I think we've covered really so much detail in the book. By the way, everyone, and you know, you should read it. You're going to learn a lot about climate change. Again, all referenced. You know, when I was reading through it, and I realized, what we covered that on our show. We covered that. You do get the science right, but it's in these conclusions, these high level things like, where do we go if we do cut our emissions? What's going to happen? Yeah, things we don't know, right?
I mean, this is where the political disagreements are,
Yes.
right? And I think that is essentially these are the conversations we need to be having. This is exactly, I think, what is needed, because there will be different positions on this, and you know, if we are not prepared to talk about it, then we will not be prepared to govern it in a reasonable way either.
So I'd like to now bring in Stacy, who's gonna she'll probably have a question for us, and then we're going to go to Eli, and then Stacy will come back with some questions from the YouTube channel, if you don't mind, to have a few extra minutes. So let us one second here and bring Stacy in. Stacy, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Dan, and thanks for being here, Wim.
Thanks for having it.
Well, yeah, and it's funny because before you got here, it was like, is this going to be contentious? You know, it's like because we say certain things here, and then it's like, oh no, we're a lot closer. In fact, you're very close to me in terms of, yeah, we might have to, but it would be nice if we didn't have to employ these things. It's just we keep looking and no one's changing, no one's doing anything. Although Oliver did a nice thing and said, "Stop indulging yourselves with fancy, convoluted solutions and do unto others as you would do to yourselves. For example, get out of your bloody car," which is one of my favorite solutions for climate. And so honestly, I don't want to take up time with anything else. The conversation was so rich and I have so many questions. So please go to Eli and come back. I have lots loaded up.
Oh, okay. Let's do that. And hopefully Eli, 1 second. Eli, are you there?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Hi.
Welcome, Eli.
Thanks, Stacy. Thanks, Dan. So I'd like to inject a little bit of contemporary and physical reality into this discussion. What you've said is very logical based on its assumptions, but I think you're describing what would have been great 20 years ago.
Whoop.
Oh, sorry.
Are you there?
Oh.
Okay.
Excuse me, there's somebody.
Why you first? You want to hear his question.
So sorry about that.
That was the first time we had that go. So Eli, keep going there.
Yeah. In the last week, 2,000 to 10,000 people have been slaughtered in El Fasher, in the civil war in Sudan, which is largely driven by climate. You speak of geopolitical conflict over solar geoengineering. We are in store for a lot of geopolitical conflict over climate disasters and stresses if we don't do anything to avert that. The climate response is such that reducing climate dynamics is such that reducing emissions or even large-scale carbon dioxide removal at the fastest rates that anybody other than me maybe is talking about will take years and years, if not decades, to have much of a measurable effect on measurable tempers and even some of the amplifying feedbacks. In terms of international cooperation, it's always been anemic at best, and it's a process where, you know, which entails the participation of bad actors, and they participate on the basis of their ability to monkey wrench it. So,
the question, Eli?
I think I'd like to ask, you know, at what point do you recognize that things have gotten away from the model that you've laid out, how we can, the best strategy for addressing this?
I think similar to what we were talking about there.
Yeah. So, but, I mean, I think things haven't really gotten away from model. I think my argument would be we've never really been there, and as we discussed, I think you'll have to deal with these realities irrespective of what you prioritize, if it's carbon removal, storage engineering, or emission reductions. And so we have
Well, I do have to interject that unlike fossil emission reductions and carbon dioxide removal, solar geoengineering is fast acting. There can be a very noticeable effect in under a year.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the political effects. I mean, I think you'll have to deal with the fact that there will be. I mean, imagine what the kind of conversation at the UNFCCC would be about agreeing the kind of level of sulfur, stratospheric sulfur injection. I mean, we can't even agree on, like, adaptation funding for the global south or loss and damage and these kind of things, let alone like what the optimal temperature on global Earth would be, right? And what that would look like in terms of, the reshifting of regional climates or the kind of temperature gradient. These will be super contested discussions. I mean, it's very hard for me to see how one could do that, even if it's fast acting, in a way that is either has to be autocratic, which is obviously not something that we want, or it will have to be a very kind of long political process to put the institutions in place that will be able to govern that, because it will be super contested. How you do it is everything in this, right? Because how you do it determines in many ways the side effects and so on.
Okay. Well, anyway, Eli, thank you. And let's go back to Stacy and get some of the chat questions. I have one that was pinned here from Gene. Not a criticism, but how much of focusing on academics and theory clouds the mind of the realities of the abilities of the human race just being too stupid and short-sighted? So, do you factor that into your research? That maybe we're not rational beings like we think we are. That's for sure, right?
I mean, much of politics in the US kind of proves this, I suppose, that rationality has left the building at some point.
That's right.
So I don't know if that's a real question, but Stacey, what do you have there?
I wish I don't know if we've kept track of our comments during the program, but I think this one might be off the charts. This is there's been a lot of great conversation, and as the you saw the ticker go across, please like and subscribe so that more people can hear this great program with Wim and the message. I liked Jean said that Santa should put biochar in everyone's stockings, and Oliver is trying to get Pope Leo to advertise outside of the Vatican and all the churches about climate change. These were good things. And what would it take for people to wake up was a big one. Would a Cat 6 hurricane in Louisiana, say, where all the oil refineries are, get people to wake up? Or would it be a Cat 5 in New England, a blizzard that stalls all of the east coast of the US? And the one question here about, if the Amazon passes its tipping point, who will manage the disaster and with what legitimacy? Is that something that's covered in the book? I didn't get a chance to read it all.
I mean, we don't really talk about like what happens after these tipping points. Obviously, these are super important questions, but it's not. Yeah, I mean, in many ways, academia is just starting to grapple with the whole tipping point question. Of course, the literature on this has been growing very rapidly, but we're only really starting to talk about the governance of this, right? And how do you actually deal with, I mean, not just preventing it, but the fallout of these tipping points. And yeah, I mean, it's, I think we'll have to think very creatively there, because, adaptation is not going to cut it when, temperatures fall by 20 degrees in Northern Europe. And so,
well, by that point, it's not game over necessarily, but I mean, it's game over in many ways. I mean, it's not like something that's going to be fixed by lowering emissions anymore once you pass these tipping points. And that is part of it, right? There's so many tipping points at 2 to 2.5 that we don't even know about.
But so this is just to say that this is a very good question, and I think it's something that few people have real answers to at the moment. Because I mean, it's also, I mean, for us, it's really hard to imagine when something that radical happens, what our society, how our societies are going to react, right? I mean, the Amazon is such a key part of, I mean, Amazon, South American climate systems, but also so much more than that, of course. So, yeah, these things are unimaginable, and this is why it's absolutely crucial to avoid them, of course.
I also the conversation spurred around talking about climate change with people.
Yeah, there's a lot of comments on that.
Yeah, if you want, someone started no one at the office wanted to hear them talk about it. So if they needed privacy, they just said climate change and they got it.
And again, I was at a wedding yesterday, a beautiful wedding, by the way, and a friend of mine, and it doesn't matter where I am, I'm going to talk about it. I just tell you, it's not something that people want to engage on. And these are people that believe it. They're not deniers or anything like that. Just regular folks going about their lives. And to me, seeing that, knowing what we know already, what we've seen already, the fires in California and Canada and all the hurricanes, Cat 5 hurricanes, and we really have a good ability of blocking that out of our heads. So we have to not just take politics into account, but I think psychology or something.
Yeah. That was one. It's a good test of the room for MAGA. If that's a great MAGA detector, is just to bring up climate, and they'll come out radically.
But even the ones who aren't MAGA at all, anti-MAGA, it's not that they reject what you're saying; they just don't want to hear it.
It's like talking about cancer. It's why are you bringing that up? That's so unsavory. Versus, oh hell no, that isn't happening.
So Wim, let me ask you a question about this general topic, because you do study, the politics of climate, and you study politics in general. What techniques or I don't know, efforts are effective in shifting populations in a relatively short time? What do you think might work in this situation? Maybe it's not working now and whatever, but something you think maybe a small group can do collectively that might engage a larger group?
Yeah, I should also say I probably need to go soon. Actually,
let's end it.
But this is not my main. This is not my main research focus. But I think, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity. I mean, first of all, I think we should probably take responsibility for creating these what can be uncomfortable discussions. I think there's a lot of opportunities for framing climate change in ways that actually do appeal to people's. I think redistribution is a key element, for example. I mean, it's very clear that climate change is a very unequal. The people with the vast majority of income are also the ones with the largest carbon footprints and so on. So, I mean, framing carbon emission reductions and climate policy in terms of redistribution, I think, to me, has a lot of potential, because it's very clear that you can win a lot by targeting the largest polluters first. It's not going to be sufficient to do that, but that is where the first action needs to happen. And I think very often when we've seen resistance to climate politics in Sweden, in France, and so on, it's because policies have failed to take the redistributional aspects into account and fail to see that people will resist if they feel it's happening in an unjust way, right? So, but I mean, you're very right that this is about psychology, this is about sociology. I mean, all these fields come together in this, of course. So there's no silver bullet, unfortunately. Otherwise, I guess I would have won a lot of elections if I knew what it was.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us, and everyone. Here's the book again. Again, links
And
in the
I
description.
just want to remind people there were so many good questions. Please, if you your question was not asked, please put it in the comments of the show after we're done,
It's posted. Yeah.
because Dan is very good about going back. And Wim, if you too want to go back and check out, we get a lot of comments
Absolutely.
afterwards. So
Oh, yeah.
please post there. Thanks.
But anyway,
Yeah.
it's a really interesting book. It's not as long as it looks because, again, there's lots of references in it. But anyway, so thank you for coming. Fascinating discussion. You really hit upon so many of the aspects of what we cover on Climate Chat, from the science to the policy to everything. And so I think people who watch this show will really find the book fascinating. Thank you, and thanks to Andreas as well. Send him my best. And thank you for coming, and good luck with the book and all your research.
Thank you so much, both of you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
And everyone, like and subscribe, as Stacy said before, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.